The truth that no one dares to tell you is simple. You're not destroyed by the world. You're destroyed by your own reactions to it. As long as you continue reacting like everyone else, feeling like everyone else, and responding like everyone else, you remain predictable, manipulable, and deep down fragile. And the most dangerous part, you don't even realize it. Because you were taught that being authentic is reacting, that being true is expressing everything, that being strong is facing everything head-on. But what if all of that is wrong? What if true strength lies precisely in what you don't show, in what you don't react to, and in what you choose to ignore? There is a set of principles that have never been openly taught, not because they are complicated, but because they are uncomfortable. Principles based on the stark reality of human nature, not on pretty ideals, something that Machiavelli understood centuries ago. Whoever masters their own mind masters the game. And here's the point that might bother you. Perhaps you are losing battles every day, not because you are weak, but because you are playing the wrong way. Reacting when you should observe, feeling when you should analyze, exposing yourself when you should restrain yourself. Today, you're going to understand the 7 dark principles that transform an ordinary person into someone impossible to break emotionally. It's not about becoming cold. It's about becoming strategic. It's not about stopping feeling. It's about stopping being controlled by what you feel. And if you truly apply this, not just listen, you'll realize something disturbing. The same situations that once shook you simply cease to have power over you. And that's exactly where everything starts to change. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul. An invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder. You are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. He begins by understanding something almost no one realizes. The world doesn't control his emotions. Triggers do. And as long as he doesn't create a distance between what happens outside and what happens inside, he lives as an automatic reflex of the environment. That's where the first silent principle comes in, something even Machiavelli would perfectly understand within the idea of decisions based on real human nature. He learns to create a dead zone between stimulus and reaction. It seems simple, but it's brutal in practice. Imagine someone disrespecting you. The immediate impulse is to respond, react, prove your worth, but he holds back. He observes. He breathes, not because he's weak, but because he understands that the end justifies the means, and reacting without strategy is losing power. A practical exercise. Whenever something irritates you, wait 10 seconds before responding. That's all. You already break the automatic cycle, and over time, those 10 seconds become absolute control. And control in this game is worth more than reason. At first, he realizes that this decoupling seems strange, even artificial. It's as if he's betraying his own emotion. But in reality, he's refining his virtù and fortuna, the ability to act with precision, even under pressure. He begins to see patterns. Certain people always provoke him, certain environments always wear him down, certain comments always activate something within him. And instead of reacting as he always has, he begins to study these triggers like a cold scientist. This changes everything. Because now he's no longer inside the emotion, he's analyzing the emotion. A simple example. Instead of arguing in a meeting, he mentally notes who tried to destabilize him when it happened and what the objective was behind it. He collects data. This is politics guided by reality, not by ideals, applied to real life. And little by little, he begins to realize something dangerous. The less he reacts, the more unpredictable he becomes. And that's where the game completely changes. Because when he stops reacting automatically, he starts choosing when to react. And choice is power. He understands that not every provocation deserves a response, nor does every situation require an immediate stance. He begins to apply the principle of avoiding being hated, but not in the sense of pleasing others, but rather of not exposing himself unnecessarily. He controls his own image, maintains an appearance of virtue, while internally calculating each move with precision. A powerful practical example: instead of responding to messages impulsively, he starts responding at strategic times with short and neutral answers. This reduces friction and increases control. And without realizing it, he is no longer the same. Because by creating this dead zone, he not only decoupled emotion, he began to reconstruct his way of existing in the world. And without saying anything, he is already beginning to move towards something deeper, something that involves not only controlling reactions, but completely changing how he positions himself within his own mind. He begins to realize something uncomfortable. As long as he keeps saying, "This is happening to me," he will remain a hostage to circumstances. It seems harsh, but this is where most people freeze. Because taking psychological responsibility isn't about guilt, it's about control. And control requires maturity. At this point, he abandons the role of silent victim and adopts an almost clinical stance towards his own life. He observes situations as a researcher, not as someone emotionally involved. This is pure application of decisions based on real human nature. He understands that people act out of self-interest, fear, insecurity, not justice or idealized morality. This is where he begins to internalize in practice that politics guided by reality, not ideals, is not just a concept, it's a way of operating. A simple example. Instead of thinking, "I was disrespected," he thinks, "What was the interest behind this behavior?" This change seems small, but it completely shifts the power axis of the situation. The more he practices this, the more he realizes that emotion begins to lose its power, because emotion needs a narrative to survive. And when he replaces the emotional narrative with strategic analysis, the impact drastically diminishes. He begins to see each situation as a game of movements and intentions, not as something personal. This doesn't make him cold, it makes him precise. He understands that often the other person's attack has nothing to do with him, but with the internal weaknesses of the attacker. And by realizing this, he avoids falling into basic emotional traps. This is what Machiavelli would call the calculated use of force, knowing exactly when to act and when to simply observe. A practical exercise here. Every time something affects you, write down 2 things on a piece of paper: what actually happened, objective facts, and what you felt, interpretation. Just by separating these, you already begin to train this clinical vision. And little by little, the difference between reality and perception becomes absurdly clear. But the most powerful point comes later. When he assumes full psychological responsibility, he stops waiting for external changes to feel better. He understands that his stability cannot depend on the behavior of others. This changes the game completely. He stops seeking validation, stops reacting to every stimulus, and begins to operate based on strategy. Here enters one of the most misunderstood principles: better to be feared than loved. Not in the literal sense of causing fear, but in the sense of not depending on the emotional approval of others to take a stand. He becomes firm, predictable in his principles, but unpredictable in his reactions. And this generates respect, because people can no longer manipulate him emotionally. And as he delves deeper into this, a new layer begins to emerge, a layer where it is not enough to simply observe. He needs to learn to sustain multiple internal states at the same time without ever fully surrendering to any of them. He realizes that being predictable is the greatest risk anyone can take. Because when someone understands exactly how you react, that person begins to control you, even without you realizing it. This is where one of the most silent and dangerous principles comes in, the ability to sustain seemingly contradictory internal states. Calm, but alert. Gentle, but impenetrable. Present, but emotionally distant. This isn't confusion, this is pure strategy, something that aligns directly with the logic of Machiavelli and his vision of constant adaptability. He understands that always showing the same emotional pattern is like handing over an instruction manual about oneself, and whoever has that manual has power. So he begins to build layers. He doesn't always react the same way. He doesn't always position himself in the same way, and little by little, he becomes impossible to read. Initially, this requires active awareness. Because the natural impulse is to align emotion with behavior, to feel anger and demonstrate it, to feel joy and express it, to feel discomfort and react. But he begins to break this pattern. He realizes that he can feel something and still choose another behavior. This is inner mastery. A practical example. In an important negotiation or conversation, even if he is uncomfortable, he maintains a calm posture, a steady voice, a firm gaze. Not because he doesn't feel it, but because he chooses what to show. This is the appearance of virtue applied strategically. He controls the surface while precisely organizing the inner chaos. And the more he does this, the more he understands that emotion doesn't need to be eliminated. It needs to be managed, and this completely changes how others perceive him. And the effect of this is immediate. People begin to hesitate when trying to interpret him because they can't predict. Sometimes he's approachable, other times distant. Sometimes he responds quickly, other times slowly. Sometimes he engages, other times he ignores completely. This inconsistency isn't random, it's deliberate. This creates a fog around him, making any attempt at manipulation difficult. He begins to operate based on virtu and fortuna, adjusting his behavior according to the context, without adhering to a rigid identity. A powerful exercise here. Choose a pattern of yours that people already know, for example, responding to everything immediately, and break that pattern in a controlled way. Not always, but at strategic moments. This already begins to alter the perception others have of you. And while he masters this skill, something even deeper begins to emerge. Because it's not enough to be unpredictable, he needs to learn to treat each reaction as a rare resource, something that cannot be wasted. He begins to understand something that completely changes his way of acting. Every reaction has a cost, and the more he reacts, the cheaper he becomes. This is hard to accept, but it's the reality. Reacting to everything is the most common behavior, and precisely for that reason, the weakest. It is here that he internalizes in a practical way what Machiavelli applied to politics, the calculated use of force. Not every battle deserves a response. Not every provocation requires a reaction. And above all, not every emotion needs to be expressed. He begins to treat his reactions as a scarce resource, something too valuable to be distributed impulsively. Because ultimately, whoever reacts too much relinquishes control, and whoever controls the pace controls the game. This is politics guided by reality, not by ideals, applied to the simplest everyday life. In everyday life, this translates very practically. He starts ignoring certain messages, stops responding immediately, carefully chooses when to enter a discussion and especially when to leave it. He understands that silence often communicates more than any response. A direct example. Someone tries to provoke him in public expecting an emotional reaction. The old pattern would be to respond, defend himself, try to win the situation. Now, he simply doesn't react. He maintains his composure, changes the subject, or ends the interaction. This creates enormous psychological discomfort in the person who tried to provoke him, because the other person expected control and found none. This is silent power. This is where he begins to apply in a refined way the principle of avoiding being hated, not unnecessarily exposing himself in conflicts that bring no real benefit. But the most interesting thing happens behind the scenes, because by suppressing the impulsive reaction, he begins to observe much more than before. He gathers information while others expose themselves emotionally. He learns who loses control easily, who reacts impulsively, who tries to manipulate through emotion, and with this information he begins to operate with an advantage. This connects directly to the end justifies the means, not in the sense of acting unethically, but in the sense of understanding that the ultimate goal requires strategy, not impulsiveness. A powerful practical exercise. For an entire day, consciously choose to react less than usual. Observe how many situations simply fail to escalate when you don't engage in the game. This will show you in practice how much your reactions fueled unnecessary conflicts. And as he masters this, an even deeper need arises, because it's not enough to control the present. He needs to learn to release the past that still influences his decisions. He realizes it's not the events of the past that hold him back. It's the emotions he still carries about them. And as long as those emotions remain alive, they influence his present decisions without him realizing it. This is where one of the most underrated skills comes in, separating fact from feeling. He keeps the data, who did what, when, how, but eliminates the associated emotional weight. This isn't coldness, it's strategic intelligence. Something that speaks directly to the thinking of Niccolo Machiavelli and his vision of decisions based on real human nature. Because when you hold on to emotion, you distort the analysis. And when you distort the analysis, you make bad decisions. He understands that holding on to resentment doesn't protect, it only weakens. So he begins to practice something difficult, remembering without feeling. Initially, this requires conscious effort, because the brain tries to relive the emotion every time the memory appears, but it begins to reprogram this response. Whenever a negative memory arises, it doesn't dwell on it, it observes it as a fact. This happened. What did I learn from it? That's all. No drama, no narrative, no emotional repetition. A practical example, someone who has betrayed you. The common pattern is to feel anger whenever you think about the person. The new pattern is simple. You remember the behavior, register that person's pattern, and adjust your level of trust. That's all. No emotional charge. This is calculated use of force applied internally. You don't need to hate someone to protect yourself from that person. And when you understand this, you free yourself from something invisible that was consuming your energy. And the effect of this is absurd, because now the past ceases to be a burden and becomes a tool. He uses past experiences as a strategic reference, not as an emotional trigger. This makes him much lighter, much faster in his decisions, and above all, much more difficult to manipulate. Because emotional manipulation depends on open wounds, and he begins to consciously close these wounds. This connects with virtù and fortuna, the ability to shape one's own destiny based on how one reacts to what has already happened. A powerful exercise here. Write down 3 situations from your past that still bother you. Now, next to each one, write only the objective lesson that it brought you. Read only the lesson, ignoring the emotion. Do this for a few days. You will notice that the pain begins to lose its strength. And while he masters this skill, something even more strategic begins to emerge, because it's not enough to control what you feel. He needs to start controlling how others perceive you, completely fragmenting the image they build of him. He understands something most people ignore. People don't deal with who you are. They deal with the image they can construct of you. And the more complete that image, the easier it is to predict, label, and eventually manipulate. This is where he consciously begins to apply a principle deeply aligned with the thinking of Niccolo Machiavelli, the appearance of virtue as a strategic tool. He doesn't present himself the same way in every context. He adjusts his language, posture, level of exposure, and even emotional intensity depending on the environment. It's not falsehood, it's constant adaptability. Because he understands that absolute consistency can be a weakness when it makes you too predictable. So he begins to fragment the perception others have of him. In everyday life, this manifests in subtle but extremely effective ways. In a professional setting, he might be more objective, direct, and analytical. In a social setting, he might be more relaxed, observant, even quieter. At times, he shares profound ideas. At others, he remains completely neutral. This prevents anyone from building a complete profile of him. A practical example: he avoids revealing everything about his life, his plans, or his intentions. He shares enough to maintain interaction, but never enough to be fully deciphered. This is politics guided by reality, not ideals, understanding that excessive exposure rarely brings strategic advantage. And with this, he creates a kind of psychological fog around himself, where each person sees only a part of him, never the whole. And the result is powerful. Because when no one can fully map you, no one can anticipate your moves. He begins to operate based on his own loyal armies, in the symbolic sense of keeping his internal resources under control, without surrendering them to the external environment. He chooses what to show, when to show it, and to whom to show it. A practical exercise here: start observing how much you automatically reveal in conversations, opinions, emotions, plans, and then reduce that by 30%. Don't disappear, just be more selective. You will quickly notice how the dynamic changes. People start exposing themselves more while you observe more. And as he masters this fragmentation, he approaches the final level. A level where it's not enough to control perception or emotion. He simply chooses not to participate in the emotional game they try to impose on him. He finally understands something few people are clear about. The emotional game only exists if he agrees to play it. And most of the time, the real advantage isn't in winning the argument. It's in not engaging in it. This seems simple, but it's profoundly strategic, because when someone tries to provoke, manipulate, or pull you into a reaction, there's an invisible expectation that you participate. And when you simply don't engage, it creates a psychological void that's difficult to deal with. This is where he applies, in a refined way, the thinking of Niccolo Machiavelli within the logic of the calculated use of force. Understanding that the greatest demonstration of power is often the absence of reaction. He doesn't resist, he doesn't confront, he doesn't over-explain, he simply doesn't participate. And this completely breaks the expected dynamic. In everyday life, this manifests itself almost invisibly. Someone tries to create conflict. He doesn't respond with the same energy. Someone tries to provoke him. He doesn't justify himself. Someone tries to manipulate him emotionally. He doesn't react. And this doesn't come from weakness, but from clarity. He understands that engaging in certain exchanges only drains energy and doesn't generate any strategic gain. A direct example: in a discussion where the other person is clearly emotional, trying to pull you into the same state, he maintains short, neutral answers or simply ends the interaction. Without drama, without excessive explanation. This creates enormous discomfort in the person on the other side because the attempt at control fails. This is intelligently avoiding being hated, not fueling unnecessary conflicts, and not exposing oneself emotionally where there is no return. And then comes the most powerful point. When he masters emotional non-participation, he becomes virtually impossible to manipulate, because manipulation demands a response. And when there is no response, there is no control. He begins to operate with a firm but silent presence. He doesn't seek to prove anything. He doesn't react to validate his own ego. He doesn't enter games he didn't choose to play. This connects directly to better to be feared than loved. In the deepest sense, he doesn't need the emotional approval of others, and this in itself generates respect. A practical exercise here. The next time someone tries to provoke you or pull you into a reaction, simply reduce your response to the bare minimum, or don't respond at all. Observe the effect. You will realize how much power often lies in what you choose not to do. And it is precisely here that this whole process begins to fit together. Because now it's not just about control, it's about becoming something that most people can't even comprehend. Now let me ask you a question you might avoid answering. How many times have you wasted energy, time, and even respect simply by reacting without thinking? How many decisions have you made in the heat of the moment that, looking back now, make absolutely no sense? Most people never stop to face this. They prefer to blame the world, circumstances, others. But you've already noticed that there's a pattern there. And if you've gotten this far, it wasn't by chance. Something inside you has already understood that continuing as you are is no longer an option. So the question is no longer, does this work? The question is, will you have the discipline to apply it? Because understanding these principles is easy. What's difficult is practicing them when someone provokes you. What's difficult is remaining silent when everything inside you wants to react. What's difficult is not participating when the emotional game is happening right in front of you. But that's exactly where the transformation happens. That's where you stop being predictable. That's where you stop being manipulable. And that's where you truly begin to build a shielded mind. Not through the absence of emotion, but through mastery over it. Now I want you to think about something simple. Which of these principles do you most need to develop today? Where do you most often lose control? Is it in impulse? In the need to respond? In the difficulty of letting go of the past? Choose one, just one, and start with it today, because it's no use watching, agreeing, feeling that it made sense, and continuing to live exactly the same way tomorrow. And if this type of content has made you see something you didn't see before, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here you don't learn what's comfortable, you learn what works. And the more you understand the game, the harder it becomes for someone to play against you.